My professional life has taken me to many parts of the world embroiled in conflict. I have witnessed firsthand the impact of bombing, shooting, beating, and many other forms of violence. I have become convinced of two things. First, that all forms of violence can be interpreted in terms of people's health, and second, a science-based approach to violence would base any dialogue about this complex human phenomenon in commonly used terms and constructs. In turn, this would lead to consistent policies for security issues, preventive measures, diplomacy, education, and the application of national and international laws. In other words, talking in a consistent way about violence can only lead to a consistent approach to humanitarian action. First of all, what do we mean by violence? For this brief video, we propose combining the existing World Health Organization's definition of health and violence. Violence, therefore, can be defined as the intentional use or threat of physical force against a person, group, or community that has a negative impact on the victim's physical, psychological, or social well-being, including deprivation. In other words, the many and varied forms of violence that we experience or know of from everyday news all have, in one way or another, an impact on people's health. Violence always happens in a context, that is, a time and a place. The elements of any form of violence are intent, that is, the psychological potential of the perpetrators to cause the impact in question; physical capacity, that is, the perpetrator's physical potential for violence given by the number of bombs, guns, knives, batons, broken bottles, fists, etc. Vulnerability, that is, the potential of the victim or victims to suffer the impact in question. And of course, the impact, that is, the impact on the victim or victim's health. The impact is always measurable in terms of, for example, lethality, number of people dead and or injured, the number of people starving through forced displacement, the number of people sexually assaulted, etc. If we talk about threat, this is a combination of the intent and the physical capacity. A health-based approach dictates that the intent, the physical capacity, and the victim's vulnerability are risk factors for the impact.
The theory of violence explains the elements of violence and how they interact. It is based on work by Robin and Nathan Taback at the University of Toronto. So let's take some first steps to move this into science. A useful parallel is to think of violence as the perpetrators having intent to spray someone with water. The perpetrator's physical capacity is given by one or more reservoirs of water, each of which has a tap and means of delivery, that is anything from a garden hose to a water cannon. The number of reservoirs, the volume and the pressure of the water in them, the precision of a means of delivery when the taps are turned on, together account for the variability of a physical capacity. Lastly, the victim's vulnerability is determined by, for example, proximity to the hose or cannon, their mobility, availability of shelter or shields, and waterproof clothing. The impact could be theoretically measured according to the volume of water per second hitting the victim, and practically on a scale according to whether the victim is 0 dry, 1 damp, 2 wet, 3 very wet, 4 totally soaked, 5 incapacitated. The parallels with use of firearms is obvious. This theory of violence is pertinent to any form of violence with any weapon in any context. Importantly, it allows us to conceive of potential feedback to intent from the other risk factors. Using our parallel, the perpetrator may find the spraying of water particularly effective if a victim can be caught in a confined space. Alternatively, the perpetrator may stop spraying to conserve water or when the victims have moved away. We can now see that if any form of violence takes place in any context, the risk factors must always be present and have a defined but dynamic relationship with the impact and with each other. If one of the risk factors does not exist, there can be no impact. Think of the risk factors as the length, height, and width of a box. The impact of a violence in question is the volume of a box. If one of a box dimensions is 0, the box volume is 0. Any preventive measure is related to one or more of the risk factors. No preventive measure is unrelated to these risk factors. What this means is that given enough data, violence could ultimately come down to science. It is important to note that a number of database studies support this theory of violence, and no conflicting evidence has been identified.
Understanding the relationship of the impact with its risk factors brings an objective view of the context in question. Let's look at a real-life example. In an area of conflict, 50 people are found dead in a roadside ditch. They have all been shot in the head and chest. The media claims this was a massacre by the army, a war crime. The army claims there was a battle. However, no wounded survivors have been found with limb wounds. This is not compatible with a battle. Therefore, the impact, that is 100% mortality of people shot, means that the victims must have been brought to a state of extreme vulnerability, such as being forced to lie in the ditch before being killed. Therefore, assuming the physical capacity at their disposal is constant, the perpetrator's intent was not to fight a battle, it was to kill a group of people. In such a situation, the media and lawyers tend to focus exclusively on intent in the pursuit of justice. However, understanding vulnerability is often the key to determining the whole context and the actions of the perpetrators. International humanitarian law, international criminal law, the international law of arms control and disarmament, and much of human rights law can ultimately be argued in terms of mitigating the impact of many different forms of violence and addressing the associated risk factors. And finally, consider this: how a country treats its prisoners and minorities can be a powerful indicator of how civilized it is. Prisoners and minorities are extremely vulnerable to violence by authorities. Every act of inhumanity or crime against humanity is ultimately an act of violence. It follows that a principal feature of humanity is the degree to which we restrain our capacities for violence. This ultimately comes down to how the intent of potential perpetrators of violence is moderated by considerations of the physical capacity at their disposal, the potential impact of the violence on the victims, and the victim's vulnerability. To talk humanity, we have to be able to talk violence.